Yum, yum!
So a friend of mine asked me yesterday if I had an easy way to spit out a bunch of info about a folder of rendered images. I didn't have anything on hand, so I quickly threw something together. I call it renderstats.py. It's a simple tool. You point it at a folder, either a folder or a file in a folder, doesn't matter. And it will spit out a bunch of info about that folder. Most important, some render stats, like how many files are in there, what's the overall render time from the first to the last image, the average render time per frame, as well as the maximum and the minimum frame. The values here are a little bit out of whack because that's a pretty old render from, I don't know, from April this year. And I've just now created 4 new files. So that's why I have such a large render time, because there's a few new renders a couple of months later. But I've created these to show it will list missing frames. So I have range going to 1750 and then a bunch of missing frames, and then we pick up at 2409, and it'll report that it found these 2 contiguous frame ranges, the original range and then my 4 new frames, and also the 658 missing frames, namely from 1751 to 2408. These newly created frames, I've just created blank empty dummy files, so they have no size, and the script will pick that up as well and report these 4 frames as broken because they are smaller than a given threshold. This threshold we can set up. So if we look at the help again, we have a bunch of switches. We have the T switch, which is basically a percentage threshold. So what the script will do is look at the file size of all the files in the folder, generate an average file size, and if any one file's specific size is below, in this case by default 50% of the average file size, it'll report that. So if we go threshold of 0.9, which means 90% of the file, if a file is 90% or smaller than the average file size, it'll get reported, and 233 of those files are 90% or smaller than whatever the average file size is in this folder. We also have a size limiter, which is by default set to 128 bytes. This value is chosen because broken EXR frames often come in with a tiny size of 128 bytes, so it doesn't make sense to check for 0 size files. But I'm rather checking for files that are smaller than 128 bytes. There is also a naming option, which comes into play if you use the file option. So if we go F, it will create a render stats.txt in that folder, which has the output in it. That's mostly useful in combination with the R for recursive. So if you give it, let's not do the file right now, if you give it, let's say, this top folder here, and run it recursive, it'll go through every folder and report the stats for every folder in there. Obviously, going with the terminal output gets a little overwhelming, so what you do is do a recursive and a file, and it'll put a renderstats.txt in every subfolder, so you can check each sequence on its own. And then if you want to name your file anything else, you can do that as well. with the N option, which will, where are we? Oops, wrong folder, file, N and test.txt, and that'll create a test.txt instead. And that's about it. So just a bunch of options. You throw it at a bunch of files, it spits out a few hopefully useful statistics and a bunch of warnings in case of broken or missing files. The script will be available as download on the blog page, and there'll be a link to that in the YouTube description. And I hope you find the script useful and you can do with it as you please.
Yum, yum!